Friends, I welcome you to my channel. Before listening to this story, I will ask you to like and subscribe. It is not difficult for you, but it is pleasant for me. And we're starting. Dorian stood in a long queue at the airport check-in, looking at the beautiful profile of his charming wife Salome. She was one of those rare people whose profile was even more beautiful than the front view. He not only loved her, he adored her. He searched for her for a long time, but she was worth every second of waiting. He couldn't help but smile at the sight of her boyish hairstyle, cute button nose, and chiseled lips. "What's so funny, Dor?" Salome asked him with a soft smile, without turning her head. "Nothing, Sal. You're just amazing," he said proudly, looking at her long, muscular legs, which were beautifully accentuated by yoga pants. Their relationship had its ups and downs. Dorian was not an easy man. He was a man of principles. Not many people could meet his high moral standards. Sal was the only woman like that. She was not an easy person herself. An uncompromising vegan, a minimalist, an environmental fanatic, and a shelter volunteer. It would be fair to say that if they had not met each other, they would probably have remained single for a very long time. They were introduced 2 years ago by a mutual friend, Betty. Sal and Betty have been working in the legal department of a major advertising agency for the last 10 years. Betty first dated Dorian. The spark between them flared up instantly, but their opposing worldviews and Dorian's complete unwillingness to compromise made it almost impossible to continue their relationship. However, in the end, they remained good friends. It wasn't difficult for Betty to introduce him to her best friend, Sal. They weren't a perfect couple. Dorian was just a vegetarian, not a vegan. He belonged to the right camp, and she belonged to the left. He loved dogs, and she loved cats. His Belgian shepherd didn't like her ginger cat. He preferred to spend time alone with her, while she preferred socializing, hanging out, and partying. However, the commonality between them overcame the differences, and love broke out in the blink of an eye. 10 months after their first date, they got married. In 2 weeks, they will celebrate their first wedding anniversary. Sal gave up birth control a month ago. They were ready to have children. Dorian worked as a department manager for a large security company. This job was arranged for him by one of his former army commanders. His service was shrouded in mystery. Whatever he did for his country, he did it very well. He retired from the service at the age of 27 after experiencing too many losses. Despite this, his commanders and contacts were happy to help ease his transition to civilian life. Nevertheless, he was sometimes called up to the active reserve service. It usually happened 3 or 4 times a year, unexpectedly, but not for long. Fortunately for him, it usually only lasted a few days. His friends and family knew not to ask any questions. Sal's upcoming trip was related to her work and was a very joyful event. Once a year, her company vacationed for 4 days and 3 nights at the all-inclusive resort, employees and spouses. In addition to 24-hour free alcohol, there were day and night parties with DJs, stand-up shows, small island tours, and special attractions. The company's management spared no expense. Dorian was smiling adoringly at Sal when his phone rang. His smile disappeared when he noticed the identification number on the screen. "Don't answer!" Sal screamed hysterically. He wrinkled his face in agony and shook his head but pressed the phone to his ear. Yes, I understand. I'm on my way." "No," Sal whined. "I'm so sorry," Dor whispered honestly. "You know I have to go, but hey, have fun for both of us, okay?" Sal nodded, clearly depressed. He kissed her quickly, turned around, and left the terminal. Sal was watching him wistfully when she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. It was Betty. "You and I are going to have the best time of our lives," she promised her best friend. "From now on, you're stuck with me." The flight and trip to the resort were relatively short, and check-in went smoothly. Fortunately, Betty and her roommate at the hotel, Lisa, had a room not too far from Sal's room. Sal caught her breath when she saw the breathtaking dark blue bay, perfectly visible from the balcony of her room. The resort's rooms were scattered in rows on the hillside that sloped down to the beach. It was there that all the restaurants, bars, clubs, and sports facilities were located. Fortunately for Betty and Sal, their row was not high up the hill. Otherwise, climbing back up the stairs might have been tedious. After a quick shower and change of clothes, Sal met up with her friends and they went down to the dining room to have lunch. Then they jumped into the bar. They were very excited and in high spirits when they returned to Betty and Lisa's room. Oscar and Ben, the young copywriters who lived in the next room, came in uninvited with mischievous smiles. Oscar pulled out a huge joint and asked if they wanted to celebrate. The girls giggled and nodded in delight. "Where did you get this from?" Betty asked in surprise. "The attendant who brought us our luggage asked if we needed anything else." Oscar replied smugly. "It's for the mood for the whole time here." Ben put the mobile speaker on the coffee table and set up the Bluetooth of his phone while Oscar lit a joint. He took a deep breath and then handed it to Sal. Melodic techno started coming out of the speaker as soon as Sal exhaled. A pleasant dizziness seized her almost immediately. A forbidden thought occurred to her. If Dor were here with me, I wouldn't be sitting in this room with my friends enjoying wonderful marijuana. Dor drew a line under alcohol and was pretty strict about it. He hated feeling out of control. I wish he'd relax a little, Sal thought. She handed the joint to Betty, nodding approvingly that it was a good thing. Soon they were all chatting, giggling and laughing uncontrollably. Well, almost all of them. While most people become talkers after smoking, Sal tended to withdraw into herself. Adding alcohol to the mix only made her quieter and more withdrawn. She sank into a chair with her eyes half closed, slowly shaking her head and shoulders, enjoying the music and the pleasant massage sensation that passed through her whole body. Ben went to his room and returned with bottles of vodka, lemon juice, and disposable cups that he had bought earlier in duty-free. Betty made sure that Sal got her drink in a glass. Sal didn't recognize any plastic. After making toasts, they began to dance slowly to the soothing music in the room. Their vacation started right. Later that evening, a group of 5 people sat at a communal table for dinner. Sal and Oscar were engrossed in each other and did not stop exchanging flirtatious glances and smiles. As it continued in the bar, Betty felt like they had lost interest in the rest of the group. Sal was in her room getting ready for a beach party when Betty suddenly walked in. "Do you want to tell me exactly what's going on between the two of you?" Betty asked, not beating around the bush. "Nothing really," Sal replied with some embarrassment. "It's just nice to get a little attention from men for a change. No one even dares to look at me when Dor is around. He scares the hell out of them just with his own existence." "Nothing?" Betty asked skeptically. "I don't want to sound nasty," Sal said, "but I'm kind of glad Dora isn't here. He's so intense all the time, even when he's pretending to be cool, and that makes me nervous. It's nice for a change to feel free and have some fun. If he were here, I wouldn't be able to hang out with you guys in your room, and I certainly wouldn't smoke or drink more than a glass of wine. He's always so serious and careful that it's boring. For example, when we sit in a restaurant, he always sits with his back to the wall and continuously scans the main and rear entrances. He thinks I don't notice, but even when he's supposedly talking to me, he's constantly looking at other customers and even pedestrians outside the restaurant. Well, today Oscar is giving me all his attention. Oscar does not play the eternal game of agents and spies." "It's not really a game," Betty said sternly. "It's not just that Dor is used to behaving like this. There is a danger that someone might be watching him. I know, but he's not here right now. He left and I was left alone. So now I have a few days to really relax. This is my first chance in 2 years to relax a bit, and I'm going to make the most of it. Just be careful, okay?" "Of course." Later that evening, Sal went back to Betty's room. She could hear muffled voices coming from the beach. She wasn't surprised to find Oscar and Ben sitting next to the coffee table, holding drinking cups and smoking weed. When they saw her, their jaw dropped. She was wearing a short black spaghetti strap dress that didn't leave much room for the imagination. 2 stoned men were literally drooling. Sal could hear a bunch of noises coming from the bathroom. Betty and Lisa were preening there. Oscar offered Sal a drink and a joint. When Betty and Lisa finally came out, Oscar and Ben exchanged knowing glances. They felt like the happiest people on the island. There was a full moon that night. The festivities on the beach hardly needed additional lighting. By 10 p.m., many of the revelers could barely stand on their feet. Open bars made everyone too drunk. Betty's company felt about the same way. In addition to being drunk, they were slightly overheated. Oscar didn't leave Sal's side, and Betty didn't like that Sal let him hug her here and there. Ben desperately tried to make some moves towards Betty and Lisa, but he was constantly stopped. There was nothing personal about it. They did the same thing to every person who stumbled and took their shot. No matter how drunk they were, both Betty and Lisa knew that dating a colleague was a bad idea. Closer to midnight, the DJ started playing melodic techno. and the moderate, sensual rhythm really heated up the atmosphere on the sandy dance floor. Oscar and Sal slowly moved away from the rest of the group to the edge of the crowd. When they decided they were anonymous enough, they came closer and she wrapped her arms around his neck. He responded by wrapping his arms around her waist and placing his hands on the small of her back. In addition to drinking, smoking, and sensual dancing, there was another factor that made this evening deadly for Sal. The level of estrogen in the body was at a monthly peak. She was ovulating, and therefore she was very excited. At some point, Sal stopped caring about Dora, Betty, Lisa, or anyone else. All she was fixated on was releasing the pent-up tension that had been building up inside her throughout the day, and reached a truly insane level. She grabbed his arm and pulled him towards the shore. When she thought they were far enough away from the party, and especially from Betty's prying eyes, she pounced on him with a wet and passionate kiss, letting her hands wander all over his body. "We won't go all the way," she thought. "We will give each other pleasure just once and we will end it today." "Follow me," she whispered in Oscar's ear. She walked quickly to the path leading to the stairs and he followed her. She ran up the stairs without looking up, deluding herself that if she couldn't see the passers-by, they wouldn't see her either. After she and Oscar reached her room, panting as if from a climb, she had to hand him a magnetic card for the door. Her hands were shaking too much to do it herself. Oscar did just fine. Both he and she knew what was waiting for them there. As soon as the door closed behind them, they began to devour each other. After they kissed passionately for a while, she offered him the position of 69, and he gladly agreed. "Damn, that's good," she thought. Oscar wasn't as big or muscular as Dor, but he made up for it with great enthusiasm and stamina. The admiration she saw in his eyes flattered her ego. She dropped all pretense. Sal just collapsed on her stomach on the mattress from exhaustion and began to fall asleep. The next morning, Sal woke up with a terrible hangover, and Oscar was nowhere to be seen. At first, everything was a blur. She didn't know where she was. The first coherent thought that came to her mind, like a poisonous arrow piercing her temples, was, "My marriage is over." This terrible thought soon turned into panic. The guilt and shame were beyond what she could handle. "What have I done?" she scolded herself. She wanted to scream, but she couldn't. She pulled at her hair, but she didn't have the strength. She ran to the bathroom to throw up, but nothing happened. She was so thirsty that she drank rusty water directly from the faucet in the sink. Then she went back to her bed and collapsed. Wrapped in the sheets, she cried uncontrollably. After a while, a dark thought occurred to her and she ran out onto the balcony. "Ha! The slope!" She thought about it. "It's a fucking slope, I can't even kill myself." Desperate and broken, she returned to bed and lay there for several hours without moving. In all the possible scenarios she's been running through in her head, Dor will eventually find out what happened. The only way out was to confess everything, but he probably wouldn't forgive her. Even if he forgives, their relationship will never be the same. Dorian would no longer trust her, and rightly so. Even she didn't trust herself. She honestly asked herself if she would be able to forgive Dora's betrayal under similar circumstances, and the answer was no. At breakfast, Oscar and Ben learned that they were no longer welcome at the girls' table. They were very disappointed, but they didn't make a scene. That same day, Betty and Lisa rented a car and drove to the other side of the island to see an attraction called Pink Beach. They discussed whether to invite Sal, but decided against it. She didn't show up for breakfast and lunch, so they assumed she needed to be alone. On the way there, they picked up two young Italian fellow travelers. The Pink Beach was in a secluded location, half an hour's walk from the nearest parking lot. The effort was worth it. The pink sand was not only pleasant to look at, but also unusually soft. On the way back, they stopped at a vegan restaurant and ordered a takeaway for Sal. They also managed to get a couple of pills for her in the morning. At first, Sal didn't open the door for them, but after Lisa almost broke down the door, Sal relented and let them in. She looked terrible. Disheveled hair, a swollen red face that spoke of many tears, and a stale smell that suggested she hadn't showered since yesterday. Betty and Lisa wrapped their friend in a long group hug. It took a lot of persuasion, but Sal finally agreed to take a shower and then eat something. However, she flatly refused to go down to the dining room with them. She didn't want to see knowing looks or hear whispers. Completely sober and unable to sleep, Sal spent a long and painful night. Her mind was racing, asking difficult questions and giving no answers. How would she tell Dora? How much would she tell him? How could she convince him that it was a one-time mistake and that she was willing to do anything to atone for the mistake? Finally, after all the mental anguish, she came to a painful decision. She was a practical girl. If she was destined to lose her husband, she had no choice but to move on, despite all the grief she was experiencing. The next day at lunch, Betty and Lisa were surprised to see Sal burst into the dining room in a floral sundress, looking great and smiling. However, she avoided looking at the other customers. Dinner went well, and she even joined them at the final party on the beach that evening. But this time she avoided drinking and smoking. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Sal heard a light knock on her door. She wasn't sleeping. When she opened the door, she was surprised to find Oscar standing alone with a pleading look. She shook her head and closed the door. The next day, Betty, Sal, and Lisa stood quietly in line to check in at the terminal for their flight home. Oscar and Ben, who were standing behind them, didn't stop chatting and seemed very happy. At some point, Betty couldn't take it anymore, so she turned around, gave Oscar a sharp look, and said, "You look very pleased for a man whose days are numbered. You have to disappear as soon as the plane lands. Dorian will take his time until he torments you to death. With his connections, he might even confess to the murder and still be released." Then she turned to Ben. "He'll probably think you were an accomplice, Ben. I wouldn't be surprised if he was waiting for you at the airport when we land." Both turned as white as a sheet. They didn't know anything specific about Dorian's military background, but he was still the biggest and scariest guy they'd ever seen. Sal called Dorian and insisted that he not pick her up from the airport, as Betty would take her home. Sal thought Dorian would probably realize something was wrong as soon as he saw her. She didn't want them to end up in a ditch on the side of the road. Dorian was cooking dinner in the kitchen when Sal entered the house. He dropped everything and ran to hug her and kiss her. He realized something was wrong when she dodged his lips and offered her cheek instead. An hour later, they were having dinner in complete silence. The tension in the air was unbearable. "I have some bad news," Sal finally said, her voice trembling. Dor said nothing as Sal tearfully recounted the entire sequence of events. She wasn't hiding anything. She repeated and stressed that this was an isolated incident. She was practically begging. When she had nothing more to say, Dorian stood up and asked gloomily, "You said that Betty and Lisa drank and smoked with you. Did either of them end up in bed with a colleague?" "No, but—" He didn't let her finish her sentence. He rushed into the bedroom and started packing his gym bag. "No!" Sal shouted from behind him. "I have to leave." "Shut up," he hissed. When he finished packing, he headed for the front door and found Sal standing there, blocking his way. "Get out," he ordered. "No," she begged. Please stay." He put his big hand on her shoulder and easily pushed her aside. He was about to open the door when she clung to his arm with all her might and whined. Her tears and pain reached him and he froze. Sal lowered her hand when she saw his broad shoulders shake. She raised her hand and almost touched his shoulder, but she was afraid, so she just held her hand over his trembling body. She wanted to hug him tightly and never let go, but she knew it wouldn't help. She knew that if he ever decided to return to her, it must be because he wanted to, and not just because of an instinctive reaction to the sound of his wife's pain. He lingered, but eventually left. Dorian was on his way to the motel when he suddenly changed his mind and turned around. He needed to hear a different version of Sal's story from someone he could trust. He also didn't want to be alone. A cup of coffee was already waiting for him when Betty let him into her apartment. She confirmed all the details from Sal's story and added some of her own, including Sal's rejection of Oscar last night. She told him that Sal hadn't stopped crying for 2 days, and that at one point she even feared for Sal's safety. She also begged him not to pursue Oscar because he wasn't worth the effort, and said she doubted if he would even show up for work on Monday. Dorian sat gloomily for a long hour, silently staring at the floor. Finally, he got up, went into the guest room, and locked the door behind him. Betty didn't think now was the right time to ask him to forgive or move on. He needed time to digest what he had heard. At noon the next day, Dorian had not yet left the room and did not answer her knock. Betty put a tray of food by the door and told him she was going to check on Sal. Sal was in worse shape than she had been 2 days ago. It took Betty a long time to convince her to eat and drink something. Fortunately, she was too weak and apathetic to resist when Betty dragged her into the bathroom. Closing the bathroom door behind her, Betty collapsed on the floor and burst into tears. The two people she loved the most were in a terrible situation, and there was really nothing she could do to help them. Dorian had not yet left the guest room when Betty returned from work the next day. She decided to cook dinner, which included all his favorite vegetarian dishes, in addition to a special baked salmon. She smiled to herself with pleasure when she heard his bedroom door open and then the bathroom door close. He looked almost as usual when he sat down at the dining table. He even smiled and talked more than usual. After dinner, they sat in the living room with a bottle of wine. "What are you going to do?" Betty asked. "I'll get divorced." "Isn't that a bit hasty?" "At the first opportunity she got, she cheated on me. If you hadn't gotten those pills for her, she'd be carrying a bastard in her womb right now. She made a terrible mistake, but she's only human. She won't make that mistake again. Damn it, he will definitely repeat it. Once a cheater, always a cheater." "Do you really believe in this cliché?" "Yes, definitely. She will never drink or smoke without you. I doubt she'll go anywhere without you except for work. It doesn't have to happen again under the same circumstances. It just has to be the right situation." Betty tilted her head and looked at him questioningly, but he just looked at her pointedly and smiled. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she said. "Not a third, but only a second. Sal deserves another chance. I'll throw her to the wolves myself if she slips up again. I've known her for 10 years. She's a good person and she loves you very much. Even good people cheat and act badly. They don't deserve special treatment. I really think you're wrong about this. Not just about all of us humans, but especially about Sal. We can all make critical mistakes if the circumstances are right. Or wrong, I suppose. Why didn't you and Lisa make a mistake? You're not even married." "Well, not being married, we couldn't make this particular mistake. Although, of course, we had fun. But not with colleagues, and I'm willing to bet that you used protection." "Always bet on Betty you won't miss," she said mischievously. "I'll tell you what," she said after a pause. "Give her another chance, at least for a week. If after this week you decide you can't go on, I'll understand, but at least try, for both of you as well as for me. I love you both so much. I will agree to do everything to keep you two together." "What?" "Anything. I have an idea, but I don't think you'll like it." "Do you want to bet?" Sal was standing in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner. Betty had already informed her that Dorian had decided to give her another chance and would return home that evening. When she heard the front door open, she turned around warily. At first, Dorian stood at the entrance and looked tense, but as soon as he smiled at her, she dropped everything, ran up to him, jumped on top of him, wrapped her legs around his waist and covered his whole face with kisses. He tried to avoid it the way one avoids licking a loving puppy. He just patted her gently on the back. The dinner was pleasant, and Sal didn't feel any displeasure from him. For the first time in a week, she was happy and full of hope. That night, in bed, he politely rejected her advances. "It's too early for me," he explained. And she understood. She didn't kid herself that in a moment everything would be back to normal. She had all the patience in the world because there was hope. In the following days, they went out to dinner and shopping, hugged each other on the couch in front of the TV every night, and even kissed lightly. Everything looked promising. However, on Friday evening, Dorian did an unexpected thing. They were huddled together on the couch in front of the TV when Dorian suddenly said, "I have some bad news." Sal flinched and then looked at him warily. "When Betty convinced me to give you another chance," he said in a cold voice, without taking his eyes off the TV screen. "It was on the condition that you would feel my pain." Salome cocked her head to the side in confusion. "The only way for us to move on is if I get even." What? Sal stuttered. "I'm going to spend the weekend with Betty. If you can come to terms with it, then when I get back, maybe we can really start over." "She would never dare to hurt me like that." "She wouldn't dare. That was my only condition, and she has already agreed. I'll leave tomorrow night and come back Sunday night, and then we can continue." "No, please don't. This is crazy. She's my best friend. Please don't do this to me." Dorian got up and went into the master bedroom, leaving Sal sobbing on the couch. She eventually managed to fall asleep, thinking it was just a cruel experiment. "They just want to test me," she told herself. "It's just some kind of mean revenge. In fact, nothing will happen between them." The next evening, Sal stood in her bedroom and watched her husband pack his gym bag. No need, she whispered one last time before he left the house. She ran to the living room window and watched him get into the car and drive away. Part of her still believed it was just a malicious joke. When she saw him driving away, she took the keys and ran to her car. Dorian had just entered the lobby of Betty's house when Sal pulled up. She parked next to the sidewalk in front of the building and looked at the windows of Betty's apartment. She saw the dim light in the living room brighten. She saw the shadows of figures flickering on the walls. About 20 minutes later, the lights in the living room went out, and the lights in Betty's bedroom came on. Another minute, and the whole apartment was plunged into complete darkness. Sal thought she saw the curtains move in the dark bedroom, but she wasn't sure. No one heard Sal's painful scream. She was returning home in agony, tears streaming down her face. At first, she tried to convince herself that this was the price she had to pay for her infidelity, and tried to think of something else just to pass the time. It was to no avail. My thoughts returned to my husband and my best friend. She imagined them pleasuring each other in bed. At some point, her envy and self-torture turned into pure madness. She fantasized about taking a kitchen knife, running into Betty's apartment and stabbing her when she opened the door. "Yes, I screwed up big time once," she said out loud, her voice dripping with disgust. "But not with my fucking best friend who also happens to be an ex." She called Dorian on his cell phone, but he didn't answer. Then she called Betty, but all the calls went to voicemail. She even called Lisa but got no response. Sal was too out of sorts to realize how late the night was. Each unsuccessful call was a painful blow, another part of the conspiracy against her. Finally, in utter despair, she called Oscar. He arrived pretty quickly and behaved like a real gentleman. He patiently listened to her desperate cries and explanations, handing her a glass of water. When she snuggled into his lap, trembling all over, he gently patted her shoulder. When she calmed down a little, he kissed the top of her head reassuringly, assuring her that everything would be fine. When he saw that the first kiss helped, he kissed her on the cheek. He certainly didn't resist when she suddenly kissed him passionately. In the bedroom, they repeated all their exercises from their last night together, but this time it was even more exciting and enjoyable. After a while, Sal woke up from her deep sleep because the light came on in the bedroom. Why does this idiot have to turn on the light when he goes to pee? She turned in bed and felt a hand touch someone's body. If he's in bed, who turned on the light? She thought in horror. She propped herself up on her elbows and squinted painfully at what turned out to be two figures. After a few agonizing seconds, her sleepy eyes finally managed to adjust to the light. She saw Dorian and Betty standing at the foot of the bed and looking at her naked body. Betty looked furious. Dorian looked down at Sal with pity and disgust, as if he were watching a gazelle being torn apart by a hyena. "You owe me $500, he told Betty. "Yes, I know," Betty replied coldly. "You were right. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes." After this incident, Dorian no longer trusted his wife, and they divorced. Since then, Dorian has not made such mistakes and decided not to seek a new relationship because of such betrayal.